We back at it, bro. It's been like it's been about like probably like about 3 4 months. I don't know how long it's been since I've done the next video, bro. But we at it, bro. We at it, man. And I'm happy, bro. And shit like that because I'm coming back. We coming back stronger, and shit like that, and I'm building my future up, and shit like that with this and shit like that, and we're back at it, man, and stuff like that. Just life and shit like that, life hits, and shit like that, and things happen, and shit like that, but I'm not gonna explain too much and shit like that, but the one thing I will explain and shit like that, if the quality is a little bit different, and shit like that, is because I got I got a brand new fucking phone and shit like that. I actually got me a nice ass phone, too, and shit like that. I got me, a Samsung S25, and shit like that, and it's like not even like, and it's barely like the mid of 2025, and I got me like a new like phone like that and shit like that, in the 2025 year. So that shows how how new this phone is and shit like that. You feel me? Because before I had like really small like I'm not like the phone that I had before was like a damn like iPhone fucking you know I think it was like an iPhone 7. Like it was an old fucking phone, bro. Old phone. I'm so glad I don't got that phone no more, man. But we got I got I got another phone, so that's good. Where the hell is my lighter at, man? Are we back at it again? Let's go. I ain't gonna lie though, like I didn't even like turn on my phone at all, bro. Like I think this phone literally read that if I found my lighter, bro. Like literally. But let's get what the fuck? But yeah, let's get into this shit, bro. All right, so man, we better be, having, my talk for this fight, with Richardson, Hitchins, and George Kambosos, and like, man, and shit like that, like this is gonna be, a good fight, like this is gonna be a good fight, like it's gonna be a good test. And stuff like that, But I'm just saying right now, I do not see, I do not see, I do not see Richardson Hitchins losing this fight, man. Like I honestly see him winning this fight quite comfortably, and shit like that because I understand that Kambosos put up a tough fight against against sorry, and shit like that. My brain farted, the Mariana, and stuff like that, But shoot, man, and stuff like that. Because I know that on the other hand, I do know that Cambosis did beat Teofimo Lopez. Either way, I mean, I did think Teo edged that fight, but I mean, like he still put up a tough fight against Teofimo Lopez, and shit like that, But I feel like it's just like stylistically, like I feel like that Richardson Hitchins is just more of a tougher fight for Teofimo Lopez. I mean, for George Kambosos, like than Teofimo Lopez, and stuff like that, because Richardson Hitchins is more of a defensive fighter, while Teofimo Lopez is a completely of an offensive fighter, and stuff like that, So that's the thing and stuff like that, and you know and Teofimo Lopez, stuff like that, like he's a he's a tough fighter too. Both of these fighters are tough. So it's just more of like either way, it's like you never know. Cause it's just more of like, like if Richardson Hitchins was able to, I mean, if Cambosos was able to put up that tough of a fight against a guy like Teofimo Lopez, he has everything of what he can take no matter what to make it a tough fight against Richardson Hitchins. But I just feel like either way, it's a lot more harder, and shit like that. You feel me? Because it's just more of like Richardson Hitchins does very good at quickly blocking shots, getting out of range, quick like hitting and then not get hitting, and like hit and then not get hit, and shit like that. Like like a guy like Teofimo Lopez, a guy like Teofimo Lopez and shit like that, like he's more of like, again, like he's more of an offensive fighter. But the thing is though is that he also takes a good amount of hits too. Not like way more hits than Richardson Hitchins will take, and stuff like that, And that's the thing with Teofimo Lopez, and shit like that, But that's the thing, man. And that's what's gonna make it, and that's the thing and shit like that. That's kind of what makes it a little bit more different, what makes it a little bit more competitive, and stuff like that, is because, Richardson Hitches is more defensive while Teal's more, offensive, but it's just more of that at the same time, and stuff like that. It's just at the same time, and shit like that, it's like, George Kambosos can still win this fight, and stuff like that, as long as he knows what he needs to do, and shit like that, like, and he does what he needs to do to winning this fight, he could win this fight. But this is the key to victories for these guys, and stuff like that, I'm gonna start off with the big underdog of George Kambosos, and stuff like that, like what George Kambosos needs to do, and stuff like that, to winning this fight and stuff like that, is that, when, because Richardson Hitchins, he's a very defensive fighter, right? And stuff like that. He's a very defensive fighter, and shit like that. And he's quick, and stuff like that, So the one thing that George Kambosos needs to do and stuff like that, is that he needs to work on countering, but he needs to work on just throwing his punches and making sure that, that whenever he finds that opening, he needs to just throw his punches. Because it's like Richardson Hitchins, he's gonna, like, there's not gonna be many openings that Richardson Hitchins is gonna allow for, for Kambosos, and stuff like that. But the one thing that Kambosos does have is speed, stuff like that. He has a lot of speed with his punches. They both have a lot of speed, and stuff like that. But right now I'm starting with Kambosos, and stuff like that, and Kambosos, he has a lot of speed, and shit like that, and that's the thing and stuff like that, and I feel like as long as he's playing it smart, knowing like where the openings are going to be, and stuff like that, he can most definitely win this fight, or he can win this fight, or at least put up a really good fight, or like win the fight in everybody's eyes, and shit like that, and and that's the thing, and stuff like that, but I feel like what he really does need to work on too, and stuff like that, is utilizing his experience. Like, I seen Kambosos on times and stuff like that where Kambosos, like, he what was I about to say and shit like that, I like, you can see where moments and shit like that where Kambosos can move his feet around and can angle very well and shit like that, and can make it where it's just like, where, like he still is getting hit, and shit like that, but he mixes up where he's angling and then also punching very, very, very well, and stuff like that, and I feel like if he could be able to utilize a high level and stuff like that, and be able to, and to utilize more footwork in this fight and stuff like that, while, like sneaking in those punches and shit like that when he sneaks in from those openings, and stuff like that, like he can most definitely, like that's also a big factor for him to win this fight, and stuff like that, and that's the thing and shit. And that's the thing with Kambosos, stuff like that, So he has some tools to win. And he got a chin too, and shit like that. His chin should last most definitely against a guy like Richardson Hitchins, who overall, like, he has power, but he's not known to be a power puncher, and shit like that. He's more known to be a defensive, technically sound boxer, and shit like that, like that's kind of, like how he fights, and shit like that, and that's the thing with Richardson Hitchins, with Richardson Hitchins, and shit like that, and that's the thing. So, and that's the thing, stuff like that, and Richardson Hitchins, he's a tough fighter, so it's like he got to do these type of things, George Kambosos to winning these fights, and shit like that, and that's the thing, and stuff like that. Let me see if there's other, like, let me try to plan out some other things, like, for George Kambosos. And also, kind of like how I said before, and shit like that, like I don't know if I really said it, like I know I haven't really said it like that, and stuff like that, but what Cambosos needs to do and stuff like that is utilize his experience in this fight, because if he could be able to utilize, put that right there, like if he could be able to utilize like his experience in this fight, and stuff like that, like, because he has a lot more experience than Richardson Hitchins. So he needs to be able to utilize that experience, and shit like that, because that experience is gonna be a big key, because like, because I feel like he even like even though, like, like he doesn't have like a whole lot more of a different experience, but he has fought people like Teofimo Lopez, and shit like that, and he also fought Lomachenko, and stuff like that, so he's been in there with some dogs, and shit like that, and he's given them a good run for their money, like I wouldn't necessarily like say too much of Lomachenko. Lomachenko just beat him up like he was nobody, and stuff like that, but more of Teofimo Lopez, and shit like that. Like he literally scared Teofimo Lopez out of 135, and shit like that, which I mean, overall, I feel like Teofimo never really belonged at 135, and shit like that, to be honest with you, but it's just more of like he's just, after that, he just scared him out of that division, and shit like that, so like that's the thing. He needs to utilize that experience of what he has, and shit like that, against Richardson Hitchins, and shit like that, because everything should come together, and shit like that, and also another thing what he needs to do is, because whatever he does, Richardson Hitchins almost got a damn fire, but I'm just saying, the thing is with Richardson Hitchins and shit like that, is that, like, no matter what, he's gonna still manage how to capitalize, and shit like that. You feel me? Like he's still gonna know how to manage to capitalize, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, So, but that's also the same thing with George Kambosos. He also does a pretty good job with capitalizing too, and shit like that, So he needs to capitalize very well, and shit like that, because overall and shit like that, like if he does, like he needs to switch very quickly into this fight when he capitalizes. He can't just keep on doing one thing. He has to do different types of things to get in the inside and shit like that, and be able and to be able to outpunch Richardson Hitchins, and shit like that, And that's the thing, and shit like that, because he could do it, man. He most definitely can't do it, and shit like that, He most definitely can do it, bro. Like, he most definitely literally can do it, and shit like that. So, and since he can be able to capitalize very well, George Kambosos, he needs to be able to do that, and he needs to switch up very well and very quickly, because once he switches up, it isn't going to be anything normal, like knowing the skill set, with Richardson Hitchins, and knowing the skill set with George Kambosos, this isn't anything new for Richardson Hitchins, and shit like that, when it comes down to that, and shit like that, when it comes down to, switching up. So he needs to be able to come up with different game plans, different fucking game plans, very quick, and shit like that, switch up very quickly, and shit like that. No matter what, he needs to be on top, but he needs to switch up on it, and do different and look good on different things and shit like that. Like, and the one thing, like, kind of like how he did against Teofimo Lopez, where he constantly threw that right hand against Teofimo Lopez, and he was landing it very well, and it was just a beautiful, quick right hand. He was like, bop, like he was just like, it's just like he was just like he was literally just like landing that shit really quickly, and shit like that, like I like it wasn't like that right there was as fluid. I could throw some fucking combos and shit like that, ba 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 ba, but I'm just saying, and stuff like that, but I'm just saying, with what was I saying and shit like that, but I'm just saying though, so that's what George Kambosos needs to do. Quickly switch up with his game plan, and that's the thing, because Richardson Hitchins, he's a smart fighter. Once he switches up, like that's the thing, like and shit like that, like he's gonna be able to know exactly what to do. He's very quick at capitalizing, very very well, and shit like that, and that's the thing. And even when George Kambosos is capitalizing with his punches, and shit like that, it's like you never know, like Richardson Hitchins can still like end up winning those exchanges still. And then that's the thing, and shit like that. But he still needs to do that to bring in a good fight. Other than that, he needs to utilize, his, just the power, and shit like that, the relentlessness, everything else to mix it up. But that's the biggest important factor when it comes down to that. Hello, people, and niggas and niggettes. But I'm just kidding. And shit like that. I got that from another YouTuber, but anyways, and shit like that, but that's the thing and shit like that, but what was I about to say and shit like that, but with George Kambosos, like, that's the thing. But what he also needs to do is utilize that he has a really good chin. So it's like, if he can utilize that, maybe he can overpower, Richardson Hitchins, which out of everything, I feel like that's something that he's more prone to maybe to doing, because overall and shit like that, like he does look more like capable of knocking somebody out more than Richardson Hitchins, more because he throws more punches. Richardson Hitchins can do that, and shit like that, but then eventually he becomes kind of scary, and then he starts kind of just like becoming defensive, and shit. But he's a really good fighter though, Richardson Hitchins though. I'm not down, like, obviously, he's a good fighter, and shit like that, but I'm just saying, and shit like that, but he needs to utilize, that he has a good chin, George Kambosos, and stuff like that, because then he could be able to just know that he can handle the shots, be smart, but he could be able to utilize those moments and bull rush, through and stuff like that, and land those shots and shit like that of his normal routine, and stuff like that, so that's a big factor for George Kambosos. Last but not least, for George Kambosos, before I move on to Richardson Hitchins, is that George Kambosos needs to hit that body, because bro, like this dude, like Richardson Hitchins, like he always just protects his head before body. Like, I don't know why. Like, it's just like it's like he does good at defending the shots, but it's just he leaves his body. Oh shit! I don't want to fucking catch my hair on fire. But I'm just saying, like, but my nigga, like, but I'm just saying, like, but like I'm just saying though and shit like that, but like he fucking keeps his hands up high all the time, and shit like that, and overall he keeps enough room to his body where he, like, if he has enough room, he could be able to just hit that body real quick, and shit like that, because both these fighters are quick, man. These are the fight of lightning punchers, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that. So he could be able to hit that body of Richardson Hitchins for sure, and shit like that. Once he gets that body, he could work that body very well, and that can be a very good, differentiator, and like that could really be like. And honestly, he could like do everything else of what I was saying before, and shit like that, and hit the body. Like, yo, he could eventually just open up everything and shit like that, because then eventually, like, Richardson Hitchens, like, what is he gonna be able to do if somebody's really outsmarting him with like hurting him to the body? Because eventually he gonna get hurt to the body if he's getting hit really good to the body, or if he's getting hit a lot to the body, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, because overall, like, I don't think he could be able to handle like body shots like that. I mean, I don't think he'll go down with body shots like that, but I really do think Kambosos can hurt him to the body, and shit like that, and that's the thing. So he needs to be able to hit Hitchens, to the body for him to be able to win this fight, and that's the thing. So, what Richardson Hitchens next is Richardson Hitchens. So what Richardson Hitchens needs to do to winning this fight is that he just needs to fight normal of how he fights, That's really just it. It's just he has nothing really just in particular that he really just needs to do, really, besides just fight normal, and shit like that, because the reason why and shit, and shit like that, is because he's always normally a fighter that, because the other thing I was about to say is be cautious, be like, understand that you're gonna be in there with a good fighter, but he's always like usually like respecting his fighters and knowing that no matter what, the fight is gonna be a tough fight and shit like that, and overall he's always naturally defensive and shit like that, and cautiously defensive and shit like that, which that's gonna be able to pay, dividends for him in his fight, and shit like that, but that's the thing. But I feel like one of the things that he does need to do is, yes, be patient, but he also needs to show Kambosos who's really the man in that ring, and shit like that, like, don't be always so lazy and just go round by round. Really give it to George Kambosos, because Richardson Hitchens, like, he could really like put a lot of damage on people with his punches. Like when he wants to throw, he could put a lot of damage on people. He could like sneakily drop you and hurt you, and shit like that, with his punches and stuff like that, But it's just more of like he needs to have those moments where he's showing, Kambosos who's the true man in that ring, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, But also, I feel like the biggest thing too is to just counter the living shit out of George Kambosos, and shit like that. Because I feel like as long as he gives him a really good counter with the really long jab, and shit like that, with some good combinations and shit like that, that honestly he could win the whole fight doing that, Richardson Hitchens, so that's the thing and shit like that, with Richardson Hitchens, and shit like that, So that's really just what he got to do, just fight normal, just maybe just, but really just show more aggression to put more of a statement on for this fight. And that's the thing. But now this is my prediction for the fight, and shit like that, So the early rounds and shit like that, all Richardson Hitchens. The mid rounds, I would say, honestly, going detail for detail, and shit like that, I would probably maybe give, like the mid rounds a tie. But then after that, all Richardson Hitchens in the later rounds, and stuff like that, And overall, I wouldn't be shocked, and stuff like that, if Richardson Hitchens ends up stopping, George Kambosos. But overall, I'm just gonna lean more towards, a decision, or if the bets are gonna be on, I'm gonna more bet on, a decision, and shit like that, But overall, I see, Richardson Hitchins winning by a pretty dominant win, you know, and shit like that, you know, by against George Kambosos, winning this fight 10 rounds to 2, you know, against George Kambosos, you know, and stuff like that, you know. But that's my final prediction. I got, you know, Richardson Hitchins by a unanimous decision. So thank you all for watching this video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'm tired as hell because it is like almost 4 a.m. and I need to get my black ass, my brown ass to bed. Literally, bro. Like, I am just saying, bro. But I'm just saying. But again, I appreciate y'all for watching this video. You know, we're gonna grow as a community, you know, and stuff like that, you know. And peace out, y'all.